So, what makes a country a country? It seems like a really simple question, but the answer, it's surprisingly complicated and it's shaped the entire world map as we know it. In this explainer, we're going to break down the official checklist. We all see countries on a map, right? They've got flags, they've got capitals. But what is the actual difference between a recognized state and some other territory that looks and acts just like one, but isn't? Turns out the official answer isn't nearly as simple as you think. And this is what we can call the statehood puzzle. All over the world, you have these territories that pretty much function like countries, but they're not universally recognized. So what's the deal? How does the international community actually decide who gets a seat at the big table? To solve this puzzle, we actually have to go back in time, all the way to 1933, to a treaty called the Montevideo Convention. This agreement created what is still, to this day, the most widely used framework, a surprisingly clear 4-point checklist for what legally defines a state. And here they are, the 4 core ingredients for statehood. A state has to have a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. So let's break each one of these down. All right, let's start with the first 2 items on the checklist. These are the most, physical and fundamental parts of the equation, the people and the place. First up, you need a permanent population. This just means there needs to be a stable community of people who are actually living in the territory. We're not talking about, say, temporary workers or a bunch of tourists. We're talking about people who consider that territory their home day in and day out. And here's a really fascinating detail. The size of the population doesn't matter at all. International law sets no minimum number. So whether a place has a few thousand people or over a billion, the only thing that counts for this rule is permanence. The second ingredient is a defined territory. It makes sense, right? A state needs a physical address, a specific geographical area that it can call its own and actually control. It has to exist somewhere on the map. But, and this is a really critical clarification, defined doesn't mean the borders have to be perfectly settled and agreed upon by everybody. Tons of recognized states have ongoing border disputes. What really matters is that there's a core identifiable territory that is undeniably under the state's control. Okay, so you need people and a place. The next 2 criteria are all about what you do with them. It's about establishing power and proving you can act on your own. This is all about government and sovereignty. So criteria number 3 is having a government. This means there's got to be an effective authority in place that can actually run the territory. It needs to be able to do things like administer public services, enforce its own laws, and generally maintain order over its people. And here's a crucial point that might surprise you. For this test, the type of government is totally irrelevant. It can be a democracy, a monarchy, an authoritarian regime, it doesn't matter. As long as some authority is effectively in control, that box gets checked. And finally, we get to the 4th criterion, the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Now, this sounds a bit academic, but it's really just a test of independence. Does this entity have the autonomy to conduct its own foreign policy, sign its own treaties, and engage in diplomacy without some other state telling it what to do? So we have our 4 criteria: population, territory, government, and independence. It seems like a pretty clean legal formula, right? But this is where the law smacks right into the messy reality of global politics. And this is where we find the big twist. This right here is the absolute heart of the matter. An entity can check off all 4 of those legal boxes from the Montevideo Convention and technically be a state. But that is a completely separate issue from political recognition, which is a choice that every other country in the world gets to make for itself. So why is this distinction so incredibly important? Well, because this gap, this space between the neat legal definition and the messy political reality, it creates enormous practical consequences for millions of people, and it literally shapes the world map. This very tension is the reason our world is full of these international gray zones, places that function just like states but are stuck in this kind of diplomatic limbo because they just don't have that widespread recognition. Understanding this framework helps explain so many modern geopolitical conflicts. So let's just recap those 4 technical criteria one last time. To qualify as a state under international law, you need a permanent population, a defined territory, a functioning government, and the capacity to conduct your own foreign relations. But the crucial takeaway is this. There's a clear legal checklist for statehood, but actually fulfilling it is only half the battle. Everything beyond that is politics. And that leaves us with a pretty provocative question, doesn't it? If becoming a country is ultimately just a political popularity contest, what does that say about a world order that's supposed to be based on law?